I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house that was always presented to outsiders as the crown jewel of our family. It was a two-story colonial home with white-painted wood siding, green shutters that banged against the windows in storms, and a wide wraparound porch where my mother placed wicker chairs with floral cushions every spring. From the street, it looked like a picture out of a Southern lifestyle magazine. Neighbors admired it, family friends spoke of it with reverence, and visitors always commented on how perfect it seemed. Inside, however, perfection wasn't what I felt. For me, the house was more like a stage, and I was never given the leading role. I was a background figure in the performance that everyone else applauded. My father, Richard, carried himself with the authority of a man who thought the world owed him attention. His voice was deep, commanding, and sharp when he was displeased, which was often. My mother, Margaret, was softer in tone but not in favoritism. She always acted as if my older sister, Jessica, were the center of her universe. It wasn't just maternal pride. It was something more deliberate, as though Jessica was the sun we all had to orbit, and I was merely a shadow in her glow. Jessica thrived under that spotlight. She had the trophies from tennis tournaments, the ribbons from science fairs, and the scholarships that paid her way to Columbia University in New York. Every birthday of hers was a spectacle. Balloon arches, catered cakes that cost hundreds of dollars, gifts that filled entire tables. I still remember her 16th birthday when my father surprised her with a silver BMW convertible in the driveway. The whole neighborhood came out to watch her squeal with delight, and I stood quietly on the porch, clapping along as if the applause could drown out the emptiness I felt inside. My 16th birthday, on the other hand, passed with a small chocolate cake from the grocery store and a $20 bill tucked inside a card. What no one outside our walls knew was that behind the grandeur of that Charleston house lay a steady stream of unpaid bills. My father's investments had soured more times than he liked to admit, and my mother's health was fragile. Doctor visits and medications added up to nearly $1,100 a month. Somehow, though, the light stayed on, the mortgage never went into foreclosure, and the Wi-Fi kept humming. They never asked how. They simply assumed, in the way privileged people often do, that things would sort themselves out. What they didn't know was that I had been sorting them out for years. I was the one paying the mortgage when Dad fell behind. I was the one transferring money every month to cover the utilities. I was the one making sure Mom's medical expenses didn't spiral into disaster. My paycheck, my savings, my sacrifices kept that house afloat. But no one thanked me. No one even noticed. My parents seemed to believe that my life was small, unimportant, and incapable of providing anything beyond mediocrity. When relatives asked what I did for work, Dad would shrug and say, "Oh, she's just an assistant at some company up in Boston." I never corrected him. I let him think what he wanted. The truth was so far removed from the role he'd written for me that it felt almost like a secret I was keeping from all of them. The truth was this: I wasn't an assistant. I was a co-founder of Synergy Solutions, a fast-growing tech firm based in Boston. We had started with nothing but an idea, my late nights coding in a cramped apartment, and long meetings with my partner Ethan about how to secure investors. Over the years, we built something extraordinary. Our company grew to be valued at nearly $85 million, with offices stretching from Boston to Chicago. My name was printed on every contract, etched into the legal documents, woven into the company's foundation. But in my parents' eyes, I was still the one who never measured up. I didn't dress like Jessica, who filled her closet with designer dresses from Europe. I wore plain black slacks, button-up blouses, and blazers that were functional rather than flashy. I didn't live for spotlight moments or Instagram posts. My satisfaction came from walking into our glass-walled office on the top floor of a building overlooking the Boston skyline and knowing that I had built it brick by brick. Yet, in their world, I was invisible. I could have built an empire in plain sight, and they would still have dismissed me as the spare. The breaking point came one rainy afternoon in Boston when my phone buzzed with a call from Dad. I had just wrapped up a meeting with investors about a potential European expansion, and my assistant had set a fresh stack of reports on my desk. I picked up the phone expecting the usual short conversation about Mom's health or some minor household need. Instead, I heard his voice deliberate and sharp. "Jessica is bringing her boyfriend home for your mother's birthday this weekend. he said. "He's accomplished, well-spoken, and carries himself properly. The kind of man who reflects well on this family." He paused then, letting the weight of his words sink in before adding, "It might be better if you didn't come." For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My throat tightened as if invisible hands were squeezing it shut. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice lower than I expected, edged with a calm that frightened even me. He cleared his throat. "Your job, well, it isn't very comfortable to talk about. This weekend is important. We don't want any embarrassment." Embarrassment. That was the word he used to describe me, the daughter who had been quietly paying his mortgage, covering his debts, and ensuring that the family never lost the house he loved to show off. My hand trembled as I held the phone, staring out at the Boston skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my office. The city stretched out in front of me, a view I had earned through relentless sacrifice. And yet, in his eyes, I was still nothing. I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, the wood polished to a shine my assistant insisted upon, and felt my knuckles turn white. Inside me, a mixture of anger, grief, and cold clarity formed. I had always known my family didn't see me, but hearing the words out loud carved them into stone. I wasn't just overlooked. I was unwelcome. I wasn't just the background. I was a stain they wanted to erase. That was the moment something shifted in me. I realized that I could not keep living in the role they had written for me. I was not going to keep carrying the weight of responsibility while being told to stay silent, to stay away, to stay invisible. If my presence embarrassed them, then my absence would expose them. They had built their lives on the foundation of my sacrifices, and now they would feel what it was like when that foundation disappeared. As I ended the call and placed my phone down, I let myself breathe in the silence of my office. Outside, the rain streaked the glass like tears I refused to shed. I thought of that Charleston house with its green shutters and wraparound porch, so polished and proud on the outside, and realized how much of its survival depended on me. I thought of Jessica, shining like the chosen one, never knowing that the lights in her bedroom stayed on because of me. I thought of my parents, blind to my worth yet eager to take my labor, and I felt something inside me harden. They had drawn the line. They had made the choice. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to make my own. After that call with my father, I sat in my Boston office for a long time, staring out at the rain-streaked skyline. The words embarrassment and better if you didn't come echoed in my mind like a cruel chant. I could have cried, but I didn't. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me. If they wanted me absent, then they could learn to live without the silent lifeline I had been giving them all these years. I opened my laptop and pulled up the accounts that had quietly supported that Charleston house for so long. Every month, $500 went toward the mortgage, $800 to cover my mother's prescriptions and doctor bills, $350 for electricity, $220 for water, and $150 for internet. On top of that, there were other scattered payments, groceries, insurance, and the occasional surprise bill. It added up to almost $4,200 a month, a number I had come to accept as just another line item in my life. But now, looking at the long list of automatic transfers, I felt a jolt of anger. I had been keeping them afloat while being treated like an afterthought. With a few clicks, I canceled every one of them. I remember closing my laptop and leaning back in my chair, my heart pounding not with fear but with release. It was like cutting a chain that had bound me for years. For once, the weight was theirs to carry, not mine. The weekend of my mother's birthday arrived, humid and heavy as late summer in Charleston always was. I didn't fly down. I stayed in Boston, where the early September air was cooler and the trees had just begun to turn. Still, I could imagine exactly how the day would look at that house. My mother would have placed hydrangeas in the foyer. Jessica would sweep in with her perfect hair and her carefully chosen dress, and my father would beam with pride as though presenting a royal banquet. But this time, something was different. The foundation was no longer steady beneath their feet. I heard about it later from neighbors and, ironically, from Matthew Clark himself, the man Jessica had chosen to impress the family with. He was a manager at Synergy Solutions, my company. I had signed his promotion papers myself just months earlier. He worked under my direction, though he didn't know, at the time of dating Jessica, just how closely our lives were entwined. The story, as I pieced it together, was almost cinematic. Jessica had arrived at the house with Matthew in tow, proudly introducing him as someone important in her life and in the business world. My father, naturally, had been thrilled. Here was the golden daughter once again outshining the spare. The house was bustling with chatter and laughter, candles flickering on the dining table, and my mother glowing with pride. And then, in the middle of it all, the lights went out, too. First, it was just the flicker of bulbs, the kind that makes people glance around uneasily. But then the entire house sank into darkness. The hum of the air conditioning ceased, leaving only the oppressive southern heat pressing against everyone's skin. Someone tried to run the tap in the kitchen, and nothing came out but a sputter of air. The Wi-Fi cut out too, silencing the background music that Jessica had carefully queued up for the evening. Panic set in. Voices rose, sharp and confused. My father, red in the face, grabbed his phone and started calling the utility companies. The responses were the same across the board. Payments had lapsed, services had been shut down, and accounts were flagged as delinquent. My mother, usually the picture of composure in front of guests, flushed crimson with embarrassment. I could imagine her clutching her pearls, whispering apologies, trying to wave it all away as a technical glitch. But there was no hiding it. The truth was seeping into every corner of that perfect Charleston house. For once, their facade cracked wide open in front of the very people they had wanted so desperately to impress. Jessica, flustered, tried to cover for them, insisting that it must be a mistake. But then Matthew, poor Matthew, turned to my father and asked quietly, "Didn't your other daughter usually handle things like this?" He had heard enough around the office to know who I was and what I did. That was the moment everything shifted. Because when Matthew finally put the pieces together, he addressed me not as Jessica's sister, not as the spare, but as Ms. Bennett. "My goodness," he said, trying to recover from the awkwardness of the evening. "I actually work for Ms. Bennett. She's one of the co-founders of Synergy Solutions. She signed my promotion herself." I can only imagine the silence that fell over that dining room. My father's jaw, so often tight with control, must have slackened in disbelief. My mother's eyes, wide with confusion, likely darted between Jessica and Matthew as if the words didn't make sense. And Jessica, my perfect golden sister, must have felt the ground shift under her carefully polished shoes. The cruelest irony of all was that the man she had chosen to parade before them, as proof of her importance, was, in fact, someone who answered to me. A mid-level manager at my company. A man who owed his progress in part to the opportunities I had created. The invisible daughter had not only built a life of her own, but had become the very foundation upon which others, even those they admired, stood. That night, while the family scrambled in the dark, I sat in my Boston townhouse with a glass of wine, watching the city lights glitter across the Charles River. My phone buzzed again and again with calls from Charleston, but I didn't answer. Each vibration was a reminder of the power shift, a sign that they were finally seeing the truth they had chosen to ignore for so long. I didn't need to be in that room to know what had happened. I didn't need to see their faces to feel the satisfaction. For years I had been invisible, but in a single evening the illusion they had clung to collapsed. They could no longer deny who I was, what I had built, or how much of their lives had depended on me. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about balance. It was about letting them feel, even for one night, the weight I had been carrying. All along. They wanted to erase me from their story, but without me, the story itself unraveled. Later that evening, as the unanswered calls piled up, I opened my laptop again. I didn't restore the payments. I didn't undo the cancellations. Instead, I reviewed the quarterly reports for Synergy Solutions. We had just closed a deal with investors from London that would bring in an additional $20 million in capital. The company's valuation was climbing, and my role within it was only becoming more visible. The contrast between the life I had built and the one my family believed I lived could not have been sharper. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to correct them or to beg them to see me differently. The truth had revealed itself in the most undeniable way possible. The Charleston house that had once defined my childhood no longer held me captive. Its shutters, its porch, its perfect facade meant nothing now. The real house I cared about was the one I had built myself, brick by brick, contract by contract, decision by decision. As I sat there, wine glass in hand, I thought about how quiet my phone had become. The calls eventually stopped. The silence felt heavy at first, but then it settled into something else. Peace. For the first time, I was no longer carrying their weight. That was the night I realized something profound. When you stop feeding the illusion others create about you, the truth rises to the surface on its own, and I had finally let mine shine. 2 months passed after the birthday debacle in Charleston. In that time, I heard very little from my parents. Jessica, too, stayed silent, though I suspected she was still reeling from the humiliation of her carefully staged introduction to Matthew collapsing under the weight of truth. The silence didn't surprise me. My family's pattern was always the same: pretend nothing happened, wait for me to smooth things over, and continue as if my sacrifices were owed, not chosen. But this time, I didn't call. I didn't write. I didn't send money. And for the first time in years, my bank account felt like it belonged to me. The Charleston house was no longer my responsibility, and my life in Boston hummed with a clarity I hadn't known before. Synergy Solutions was expanding faster than even Ethan, my business partner, had projected. We were finalizing a deal that would increase our valuation past $100 million, and I had just signed a lease on a second townhouse near Beacon Hill. Every step I took forward was a reminder that I had built something real, independent, and strong, while my family had spent years underestimating me. It was on an unusually cold November afternoon that they finally appeared at my doorstep. I had just returned from the office, shaking snow from my coat, when the doorbell rang. When I opened it, there stood my father and mother, shivering slightly against the Boston chill. My father held a tin of cookies in his hands, the kind you buy at the grocery store on sale, and my mother clutched her purse like it was a lifeline. For a moment, I didn't move. Seeing them there after weeks of silence filled me with a cocktail of emotions: anger, sorrow, and a faint flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, they had come to say something different this time. Something real. Something resembling love. "Can we come in?" my father asked stiffly, already stepping forward as though the decision had been made. I hesitated, but finally opened the door wider. They entered my townhouse, their eyes scanning. The polished hardwood floors, the tall windows overlooking the Charles River, the subtle signs of success that filled the space. My mother murmured, "You've done well for yourself," in the same tone someone might use when commenting on a stranger's home during an open house. We sat around my oak dining table, the one I had chosen because of its sturdiness, its permanence. I placed the tin of cookies in the center, unopened. The silence stretched until my father cleared his throat. "Your mother and I have been struggling," he began, his voice less confident than I remembered. "Since the payments stopped, things have been difficult. We thought maybe you could help us with $2,000 a month, just until things even out." His words landed heavily in the air. There was no apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened on that birthday night. No recognition of the years I had carried them quietly, without thanks. Instead, here they were, asking again for money, as if my worth to them began and ended with the digits in my bank account. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands on the table. "You aren't here to apologize," I said slowly. "You're here to negotiate." My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her voice quivering. "Sweetheart, this is about family loyalty. We've always been a family. Families help each other." Her words cut deeper than she knew. I thought of every time I had helped them, every bill I had paid, every sacrifice I had made, all while being treated like the invisible daughter. Family loyalty, in their definition, had always meant me giving and them taking. So I drew the line. If Jessica matches the amount, I'll contribute. Or if you sign legal documents ensuring that any inheritance will be divided equally between us, I'll consider it. Otherwise, no. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. My father's face hardened, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch. "How dare you make conditions for your own parents?" He snapped. His voice, once booming with authority, now sounded desperate, defensive. He shoved his chair back from the table, the legs scraping against the hardwood. My mother whispered my name, her eyes shining with tears, but I held my ground. This isn't about conditions. It's about fairness. It's about respect. I've been carrying this family for years, and you never once acknowledged it. If you want my help now, then I want proof that I matter as much as Jessica. My father stood, his hand tightening around the handle of the cookie tin like it was suddenly an anchor. "We didn't raise you to treat us like strangers," he spat. "If this is who you've become, selfish, cold, then maybe we don't need your help after all." The slam of the front door echoed through the townhouse as they left. I didn't follow. I didn't call after them. I sat there in the silence, the unopened tin of cookies still on the table, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilt. Instead, I felt something else. Release. The Boston skyline glowed beyond the windows, the city alive with possibility, and I realized the weight on my shoulders had lifted. Their love had never been love. It had always been a ledger, and I was the only one keeping it balanced. Without my money, their world faltered. Without their approval, mine thrived. In that silence, I thought about what family really means. Not blood, not obligation, not endless giving without recognition. Family, real family, is about respect and reciprocity. And if I had to redefine it for myself, then I would. I stood and carried the tin of cookies to the kitchen counter. For a moment, I considered throwing it in the trash, but instead I placed it in the cupboard. Not because I wanted to keep it, but because it reminded me of something important. Love that comes packaged with demands isn't love at all. It's currency. And I was done paying for it. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the dark water of the Charles. I knew my father's anger would fester, and my mother's tears would become stories told to relatives about my coldness. I knew Jessica would side with them, painting me as the selfish one, the daughter who turned her back. But I also knew something else, something they would never admit. They needed me more than I needed them, and that truth, once spoken, could never be unspoken again. Years passed, and with each one, the distance between me and my family grew wider. Not in miles, but in meaning. Jessica eventually married Matthew, the man she had once hoped would elevate her in our parents' eyes. They settled in Atlanta, in a sprawling suburban house with white columns and a manicured lawn. On the outside, it looked like a dream. But through mutual contacts, I learned that the house was mortgaged to the ceiling and that they struggled to keep up appearances. It seemed fitting. Appearances had always been Jessica's currency, even if the foundation beneath them was crumbling, as, for my parents, their calls slowed, then stopped almost entirely. Now and then, a holiday card would arrive, always signed, "Love, Mom and Dad," as though 2 words could erase the years of neglect. Sometimes the cards contained veiled requests hidden in niceties. "Hope you're doing well. Things have been tight for us this year." I no longer responded. I had spent enough of my life translating their pleasantries into obligations. I wasn't going to do it anymore. Instead, I poured myself into Synergy Solutions, the company that had once been nothing more than an idea, scribbled on napkins now stretched across continents. We opened an office in London, then Paris, doubling our valuation to nearly $160 million. Ethan and I traveled often, presenting to investors in sleek boardrooms and walking through bustling European streets with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you've built something no one can take away. At home, I allowed myself to live in ways I had never dared before. I bought a lakeside property in Vermont, a modern house with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over still, glistening water. In the spring, I filled the garden with roses, their blooms defiant and unapologetically bold. I filled the house with laughter, not the hollow performative laughter of my childhood, but the genuine kind that echoed when friends visited or colleagues came for weekends of wine and long conversations. For the first time, I built a family of choice instead of obligation. A circle of people who valued me not for what I could provide, but for who I was. Still, there were quiet evenings when memories returned uninvited. I would sit by the window, with a glass of wine, and think of the Charleston house. I would see its wraparound porch, hear the creak of the shutters in the wind, and remember the way I had always stood in the background while Jessica basked in the glow. For years, I had believed that the house was my home, even when it never felt like one. Looking back now, I realized it had never been a home at all. It had been a stage, and I had been cast in the role of the invisible one, but I had rewritten my script. By refusing to fund their neglect, I had freed myself from it. One spring afternoon, while I was tending to the roses, I received a letter from my father. The handwriting was shaky, the kind of scrawl that spoke of aging hands. He wrote about how time had changed things, how regrets weighed heavier as the years passed. He wrote of health issues, of bills piling up, of the strain of maintaining the Charleston house without help. Buried between the lines, I could see it clearly. Another request for money. For a moment, I sat on the garden bench with the letter in my lap, staring at the lake shimmering under the sun. I thought of the little girl I had been, desperate for approval, willing to sacrifice everything for a nod of recognition. I thought of the young woman who had quietly carried the weight of her family's survival while being dismissed as insignificant. And I thought of the woman I was now, strong, independent, no longer defined by their demands. I folded the letter, placed it back in its envelope, and left it on my desk. I didn't respond. Silence, I realized, could be an answer too. The years rolled on. My company expanded again, this time into San Francisco, and I was invited to speak at conferences where my name was listed alongside industry leaders I had once admired from afar. I bought a cottage in Maine for quiet retreats, where I spent long weekends by the ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks like a reminder of resilience. My life became my own, shaped not by obligation but by choice. And yet, there was a moment of reckoning that came unexpectedly. One evening, after a long day of meetings in New York, I found myself walking past Columbia University, Jessica's alma mater. Students hurried by with books clutched to their chests, their futures still unwritten. For a moment, I thought of Jessica, of the pride in my parents' eyes when she was accepted, of the way they had framed her acceptance letter and hung it in the hallway for all to see. I remembered standing beneath it, invisible, as though my worth was measured by how brightly her star shone. But instead of bitterness, I felt something different. Release. My life had taken me further than any framed letter ever could. My worth was no longer tied to their recognition. I didn't need them to see me. I saw myself. When I returned to Vermont that weekend, I walked through the garden, running my fingers over the soft petals of the roses. They bloomed defiantly, even after harsh winters, their roots deep and unshakable. I realized then that I had become like them, resilient, rooted, thriving in my own space. Family, I understood now, is not defined by who shares your blood or your last name. Family is who sees your worth without conditions, who stands beside you without keeping score. My colleagues, my friends, the people I had chosen and who had chosen me in return, these were my family. I no longer needed to rewrite the story my parents had forced me into. I had written an entirely new one. As I stood there, the lake shimmering in the fading light, I whispered words I wished I could have told my younger self. You are not invisible. You never were. You are the author of your own story. And for the first time in my life, I truly believed it.